Welcome to Lifestyles of the Not Jet Set, the travel and tourism show powered by camp cooking fueling human muscles rather than kerosene fueling jet airplane engines. For this episode, we're just back from northern Vermont, where a group of 6 friends camped and paddled for 3 days and 2 nights along the upper reaches of the Connecticut River on the border between Vermont and New Hampshire. As you know, this show often has a mix of outdoor recreation themes along with a little bit of history tourism and reflection on environmental ethics. In this case, the outdoor recreation involved 2 canoes and 2 kayaks, heavily laden with all our camping gear, some of which you still see drying behind me. We used for our directions this very nice map titled the Connecticut River Paddlers Trail from the Wilderness Map Company, which has in its what it describes as Reach 7, a nice route. We went from Woodsville, New Hampshire to the Orford boat ramp. For wildlife, we had great enjoyment. We saw deer along the Connecticut as we traveled. A bald eagle was a highlight. We saw
swallows
in their little cliff hole nests flying all along the way, and we saw beaver. Now, I did not catch the beaver in the video, but the beaver was a highlight, and it was also connected to the history theme, which I'll say more about in a moment. For history, all of this country is connected with the fur trade that was such an important part of the European settlement of the North American continent. And I should mention that we began our trip on the first day with a land acknowledgement to the Western Abenaki people, the traditional inhabitants of this region, who were themselves involved in this fur trade. They were pinned in some ways between the aggressive Iroquois to their west, the French to their north, the early New England settlers from Plymouth Colony to their south and east. The fur trade at this particular stretch, and I'll have to pause here and let a jet airplane pass. Yes, I know it's a little ironic. The fur trade was very important to the early history of the Plymouth Colony and the Massachusetts Bay Colony in Massachusetts, because once the Europeans caught on that there was not gold in the region, as they had sort of vaguely hoped, they needed some type of economic activity to sustain them. In the 1620s, the price of beaver for beaver hats, which were popular for a century and a half in Europe, were low. But then by the late 1620s, the prices had increased, which managed, one more airplane, bear with me, which managed to save the Plymouth Colony from economic disaster. During the quiet times and lazy times in the late afternoons and evenings on this trip, I was reading the book from the 1950s called The Voyageur by Grace Lee Newt, who described the later history of the fur trade, especially in the late 1700s and early 1800s, when it was a much bigger industry. Described the intrepid French-Canadian paddlers, often in these long canoes, bringing trade goods from the east to the backcountry on their way out, and then stacked full of beaver pelts on their return. The long canoes held 6 paddlers and somebody up in the front and somebody in the back to guide them. They had this immense, almost superhuman strength to keep the pace that they would keep to travel as many miles as they would. You can imagine that our own trip had sort of a nice historical reflection on this while still being way more comfortable ourselves. As I think about the very spare food and the hardship and the scavenging that the voyageurs had to do as they traveled throughout the North American continent, and our own delightful camp cooking and more food than we need, and even camp chairs and a little camp table, all fitting in Canoe. For friends like us who are accustomed to backpacking, canoe camping seems far from being deprived, much more like a very cushy lifestyle. Of course, what really matters, even more than these material questions of deprivation or having enough material goods, both in the 1700s and right up to today, is the sense of camaraderie and friendship. Our group of six is all people whose kids grew up together and who are now either empty nesters or nearly empty nesters. And we were sort of enjoying this trip as symbolic of the fact that our vigorous outdoor activity and sense of adventurous travel didn't end as soon as the kids were grown up. And so I pointed out to the friends that isn't it a great thing that we weren't flying together, because we tend to do, a flying vacation. If it were to Paris, I bet people would have done that as nuclear families, and we wouldn't have had the camaraderie that we had together around the campfire in the evenings, playing cards and even drinking and music. And the friends, actually, who are very supportive of my environmental initiatives, still said to themselves, well, in fact, with you all, we actually would go to Paris and rent an apartment together if you wanted. But I say, don't listen to my friends. Listen to me on this video and think to yourself about what things you seek in your own travels, including both the sense of vigorous adventure and the sense of history tourism or whatever hobby it is that motivates you in your travels. And ask yourself how much of that can be sustained even without the jet fuel.